I almost didn't recognize them when they walked into my house asking for a job. The words still feel strange in my mouth, like they belong to someone else's life, not mine. But then again, 10 years can change everything. 10 years can turn the boy everyone pitted into the man no one expected. The morning they arrived, the sky was clear, the kind of crisp blue that makes everything look sharper, more honest than it really is. I was sitting in the owner's chair at the far end of the long oak table, reviewing a set of contracts, when my assistant knocked softly on the door. "There's a walk-in group applying for the management positions," she said. 3 of them. They insisted on being seen together. I almost told her to schedule them like everyone else. I almost said I was too busy, but something in her tone made me pause. "Send them in," I replied, not looking up just yet. I heard the door open. Footsteps followed. Hesitant. Uneven. Not the confident stride of people who belonged in a place like this. And then silence. That kind of silence that stretches, heavy and uncomfortable, when people realize they've stepped into something bigger than they expected. I leaned back slightly in my chair, still not turning around. I wanted to hear them breathe. I wanted to feel the weight of their presence before I faced them. It had been a long time. 10 years since the last time I saw their faces clearly. 10 years since the day everything I thought I knew about my family was taken from me in a single afternoon. Back then, I stood in a lawyer's office that smelled faintly of leather and old paper, listening to words that didn't make sense. The entirety of the estate will be divided among Michael, Linda, and Stephen Hayes. I remember blinking, thinking I had misheard, thinking there had to be another page, another clause, something. And Daniel Hayes? I had asked, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. The lawyer had cleared his throat, glancing down at the document as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves. "There are no provisions listed for you." No provisions. Just like that. 30 years of being part of that family, and I was reduced to a line. That didn't exist. I turned to look at them, my brother, my sister, my younger brother, and what I saw wasn't shock. It wasn't confusion. It was something far worse. It was relief. Subtle. Controlled. But unmistakable. Michael avoided my eyes. Linda busied herself adjusting her purse strap. Stephen shifted his weight like he was waiting for the whole thing to be over. And standing just behind them, with her hand resting lightly on Michael's arm, was Sophia. She met my gaze directly, and for just a second, she smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, just enough to let me know she understood something I didn't. Not yet. "There must be a mistake," I said, finally breaking the silence in that room. No one answered right away. The lawyer began flipping through the pages, mumbling something about final revisions and signatures, but I could already feel it. That quiet certainty settling into my chest. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. That was the day I stopped asking questions out loud. That was the day I learned that sometimes the truth doesn't reveal itself all at once. Sometimes it waits. It hides in the details, in the pauses, in the things people don't say. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg for explanations. Instead, I nodded. Just once. As if everything made perfect sense. As if being erased from my own family was something I could simply accept and move on from. "All right," I said. And that single word seemed to surprise them more than anything else. I remember Michael finally looking at me then, confusion flickering across his face. Maybe he expected a fight. Maybe he wanted one. But I gave him nothing. I walked out of that office with nothing to my name except a small duffel bag and the quiet understanding that whatever had just happened was only the beginning. And now, 10 years later, they were standing just a few feet behind me, in a house they never imagined I could own, waiting for permission to speak. I let the silence stretch a little longer before finally turning my chair around. Slowly, deliberately. And when I looked at them, really looked at them, I realized something I hadn't expected. They looked older than I remembered. Not just in years, but in the way life had settled on their shoulders. The confidence was gone. The certainty, replaced by something smaller. Something uncertain. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. And then I gave them a polite, almost welcoming smile. "Please," I said calmly, gesturing toward the chairs in front of me. "Have a seat." They did not sit right away. That was the first thing I noticed. 10 years ago, they would have taken those seats without hesitation, as if every room belonged to them by default. But now they stood there, glancing at one another, waiting for someone else to move first. It was Michael who finally stepped forward, clearing his throat in that familiar way he used when he was trying to regain control of a situation. "Thank you," he said, his voice careful, measured, as if choosing each word with precision. He pulled out the chair directly across from me, but he did not fully relax into it. His back remained stiff, his hands resting too neatly on the table. Linda followed, her movements slower, her eyes scanning the room as though trying to memorize every detail. The polished floors, the high ceilings, the large windows that let in more light than any house we had ever lived in growing up. Stephen was last. He hesitated the longest, his gaze lingering on me for just a second too long before he finally took his seat. No one spoke after that. The silence returned, thicker this time, filled with unspoken questions that none of them seemed ready to ask. I let it sit there between us. I had learned, over the years, that silence has a way of making people reveal more than words ever could. It forces them to confront what they are feeling without the comfort of distraction. And right now, what they were feeling was uncertainty. I folded my hands on the table, mirroring the posture Michael had tried so hard to maintain, and studied them one by one. Time had not been kind, not in the way they used to believe it would be. Michael's hair had thinned at the temples, and the expensive watch he once wore was gone, replaced by something simpler, more practical. Linda's posture carried a tension that had not been there before, her shoulders slightly hunched as if she had spent too many nights worrying about things she could no longer control. Stephen looked tired, not physically, but in a deeper way, like someone who had been running in circles for too long and was only just realizing it. "So," I said finally, my voice calm, even, the same tone I used in every business meeting. "You are here about the management positions." It was not a question. Michael nodded quickly. "Yes. We heard you were expanding operations and needed experienced people. We thought." He trailed off, his eyes flickering briefly toward Linda, then back to me. "We thought we could be a good fit." A good fit. The phrase lingered in the air, almost ironic in its simplicity. I leaned back slightly, letting my gaze shift to the folder my assistant had placed in front of me. Their applications. I had already read them before allowing them into this room. I knew the details they had chosen to share. And more importantly, I knew the ones they had left out. "You have quite a history," I said, flipping open the folder slowly. "Real estate investments. Retail ventures. A consulting firm." I paused, just long enough to let the list settle. All of them closed. Linda's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Stephen looked down. Michael inhaled quietly, preparing himself. "The market has been unpredictable," he replied, the words sounding rehearsed, like something he had said many times before. "We faced some setbacks, but we have learned from them." Learned. That was another interesting word. I nodded once, as if acknowledging his point, though I did not comment further. Instead, I closed the folder gently and looked back at them. "And now you are here," I said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact. They nodded again, almost in unison this time. For a brief moment, I could see the echo of who they used to be. Confident, certain that things would always work out in their favor. But that moment passed quickly. What remained was something quieter, something more cautious. I let my gaze linger on them just a second longer before speaking again. "Tell me," I said, my tone still steady, still neutral. "Why should I hire you?" The question hung in the air, simple on the surface, but heavy with everything it carried underneath. Because this was not just about qualifications. It never was. And somewhere, deep down, I could see that they understood that too. Michael was the first to respond, just as he always had been, stepping into the silence like it was something he could manage if he moved quickly enough. "We bring experience," he said, his voice steadier now, as if he had found a rhythm he could follow. "We have handled large operations before. We understand logistics, staffing, budgeting." He spoke in clean lines, like a man presenting a case he believed could still be won. Linda nodded beside him, her eyes flicking toward me, searching for any sign of approval. "We know how to run things efficiently," she added, her tone softer but carefully aligned with his. Stephen did not speak right away. He sat there, his hands loosely clasped, his gaze fixed somewhere just past me, like he was still deciding whether this was a situation he wanted to fully step into. I listened without interrupting, letting their words settle in the space between us. They sounded polished, practiced, the kind of answers that work well in rooms where no one knows your past. But this was not one of those rooms. I had known them long before they learned how to speak like this. Experience. I repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of the word. Then I gave a small nod. That is valuable. I let a brief pause follow, just enough to keep them leaning forward. But experience can mean different things, I continued. Sometimes it means success. Sometimes it means learning what does not work. Michael's jaw tightened slightly. It was subtle, but I saw it. The effort it took to keep his composure intact. We have had both, he replied. And that gives us perspective. Perspective. Another good word. Another safe word. I leaned forward just a little, resting my elbows on the table now, closing the distance between us in a way that felt deliberate. Tell me about the last company, I said, looking directly at him. The consulting firm. There it was. A shift. Small, but unmistakable. Linda's eyes dropped to the table. Stephen exhaled slowly. Michael hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. It faced some financial challenges, he said finally. Unexpected ones. Unexpected. I nodded again, as if I accepted that explanation. And how did you handle those challenges? I asked. He paused longer this time. Not because he did not understand the question, but because he understood exactly what it required of him. Honesty. Or at least, something close to it. We made adjustments, he said. Cut costs. Restructured operations. His voice had lost a bit of its earlier confidence. Not entirely, but enough to notice. I let the silence stretch again, giving his answer room to echo. Then I spoke, my tone unchanged. Did you inform your investors before or after those adjustments? That was when the room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, undeniable way. Michael looked at me, really looked at me now, as if trying to understand how I knew where to press. Linda's fingers stilled. Stephen finally lifted his gaze. No one answered right away. And in that moment, I was reminded of something I had learned a long time ago. People are not uncomfortable with difficult questions. They are uncomfortable with questions that feel familiar, questions that touch something they have been trying not to revisit. We are not here to revisit the past, Linda said gently, stepping in where Michael hesitated. Her voice carried a note of careful diplomacy. We are here because we are ready to move forward. Move forward. I let that phrase sit for a moment, turning it over in my mind. Then I smiled slightly. Not unkindly. Not warmly either. Just enough to acknowledge her effort. Of course, I said. Forward is important. I leaned back again, creating distance this time, shifting the energy of the room once more. But where you have been often determines where you can go, I added. Their expressions changed again, just slightly. Not fear. Not yet. But awareness. The kind that comes when you realize the person across from you is not asking questions randomly. That every word has a purpose. That every pause is intentional. I reached for the folder again, flipping to another page, though I already knew what it contained. You have all listed strong leadership skills, I said, glancing up briefly. Decision-making, team management, strategic planning. I closed the folder once more, letting my hand rest on top of it. Those are important qualities, I continued, especially in a place like this. I looked at each of them in turn, holding their gaze just long enough to make sure they felt it. Because here, decisions have consequences. The words were simple, calm, but they carried something deeper underneath, something none of them could ignore. And for the first time since they walked into that room, I saw it clearly. Not just uncertainty, not just caution, but the beginning of recognition, as if a part of them was starting to piece something together. Not fully, not yet, but enough to feel that something about this moment was not what it seemed. Stephen was the one who broke first, though not in the way anyone would have expected. He did not argue, did not defend, did not try to match Michael's careful words or Linda's controlled tone. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaled, and let his shoulders drop in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. What exactly is this? He asked, his voice quiet but direct. The question did not carry hostility. It carried something else, something closer to unease. Michael turned toward him immediately, a warning flickering in his expression. We are here for an interview, he said, as if repeating it would make it more true. But Stephen did not look at him. His eyes stayed on me. I met his gaze without hesitation, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the moment settle. That depends, I replied calmly. On what you think this is. Linda shifted slightly, her fingers tightening again, that same controlled tension returning to her posture. We responded to a listing, she said carefully. We were invited here. We submitted our applications. Her voice remained polite, measured, but there was something underneath now. A thread of uncertainty she could not fully hide. I nodded once. Yes, I said. You did. I let my hand rest lightly on the folder again, tapping it once, softly. Not as a gesture of impatience, but as a reminder. And I have reviewed everything you chose to include. Michael's eyes flickered again. That word. Chose. He noticed it. Of course he did. He had always been the quickest to pick up on details when they mattered. If there is something you would like clarified, he said, leaning forward slightly, you can ask directly. There it was. An attempt to regain control, to shift the structure of the conversation back into something familiar. I almost smiled. Instead, I tilted my head just slightly, considering him. All right, I said. Let me ask directly. I paused, just long enough for all three of them to focus completely. When was the last time the three of you worked together? The question landed differently. It was not about finances, not about failure. It was about something deeper, something harder to answer with rehearsed language. Linda blinked. Stephen looked away. Michael hesitated again, longer this time. It has been a while, he admitted. Our paths diverged. Diverged. I repeated the word silently. It sounded cleaner than the truth probably was. And yet, I said, my tone still even, you chose to come here together. I let that hang in the air. Because that choice mattered. It always does. People do not come back together without a reason. Especially not after things have fallen apart. We thought it would strengthen our application, Linda said quickly, stepping in again, smoothing over the hesitation. Show that we can collaborate. Collaborate. Another careful word. Another polished answer. I nodded slowly, as if accepting it at face value, though my eyes remained steady on hers. That makes sense, I said. Then I leaned back again, allowing a small shift in the energy of the room. Although, I added, collaboration tends to be easier when trust is still intact. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence that followed was different now. Not just uncomfortable. Not just uncertain. It carried weight. Memory. The kind that does not fade just because time has passed. Stephen was the first to react this time, his jaw tightening slightly before he looked down at the table again. Linda's posture stiffened. Michael did not move at all, but I could see it in his eyes. That flicker of recognition growing stronger. He was starting to feel it. Not the full truth. Not yet. But enough to know that this conversation was not unfolding the way he had expected. I let the moment sit. I did not rush to fill it. I did not soften what had just been said. Because this was the point where things begin to surface. Slowly. Quietly. Without anyone needing to force them. Tell me something, I said finally, my voice lowering just slightly, not in volume, but in weight. If I were to bring you on here, what would I be getting? I looked at each of them again, one by one, holding their gaze just long enough to make the question personal. Not your resumes, I clarified. Not your past titles. I paused. You. The words settled differently. It was no longer about skills or experience. It was about who they were when everything else had been stripped away. And for the first time since they walked into that room, none of them reached for an immediate answer. Because some questions cannot be answered with preparation. Some questions require something else entirely. And whether they realized it or not, that was exactly what I was waiting to see. Michael opened his mouth first, then closed it again. That was new. 10 years ago, he would have filled the silence immediately, confident that whatever he said would carry weight simply because he said it. But now, the words did not come as easily. I watched the shift happen in real time. The moment where certainty gives way to calculation. Linda was the one who stepped in again, though slower this time, more careful. You would be getting people who understand responsibility, she said. Her voice was steady, but not as firm as before. People who have made mistakes and learned from them. Learned. There it was again. That same word, repeated as if it could smooth over everything that came before it. I nodded slightly, acknowledging the effort without confirming the meaning. Stephen leaned forward then, resting his forearms on the table, his fingers loosely interlocked. You would be getting people who are willing to start over, he added, his tone. Quieter, more honest than the others. It was not polished. It was not rehearsed. And because of that, it carried more weight. I shifted my gaze to him, holding it for a moment longer than necessary. He did not look away. Not this time. Starting over requires more than willingness, I said calmly. It requires clarity. The words settled between us, simple but precise. Michael straightened slightly, as if recognizing an opening. We are clear on what we need, he said. Stability. Structure. A place to rebuild. Rebuild. I let that word sit in my mind for a moment. Then I leaned back in my chair again, allowing a small breath to pass before speaking. And what about what you left behind? I asked. The question was soft, almost gentle, but it landed harder than anything I had said so far. Linda's expression changed first. Not dramatically, just a slight tightening around her eyes, a flicker of something she could not fully control. Stephen looked down again. Michael held my gaze, but there was something different there now. Not just caution, something closer to recognition. We are not the same people we were, he said after a moment. It was not defensive. It was not apologetic either. It was a statement. I inclined my head slightly. No, I agreed. You are not. I let the agreement hang there, incomplete, before continuing. Time has a way of making sure of that. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence did not feel empty. It felt full of everything that had not been said yet. I reached for the glass of water beside me, taking a slow sip, giving them space to sit with the question I had just placed in front of them. Because what you leave behind does not disappear. It stays. It settles. It waits. And eventually, it asks to be acknowledged. When I set the glass back down, I did not rush to speak again. I simply looked at them, one by one, letting the moment stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. That was when Stephen spoke again, his voice lower now. We lost things, he said. More than just businesses. He paused, as if deciding how much to say. We lost direction. It was not a complete answer, but it was closer to something real. Linda glanced at him, surprised, then quickly composed herself. Michael did not interrupt. That, too, was new. I nodded once, slowly. Direction matters, I said. Then I leaned forward slightly, my hands resting lightly on the table once more. Because without it, people tend to repeat the same decisions. I did not raise my voice. I did not emphasize the point. I simply stated it. And yet, the effect was immediate. Linda's fingers tightened again. Stephen exhaled quietly. Michael's gaze did not waver, but I could see it now, clearly. That growing awareness. That quiet realization that this conversation was not about whether they could do the job. It was about something else entirely. Something older. Something unresolved. I let the silence return one more time, but this time I did not allow it to linger as long. Instead, I reached into the folder again and slid a single sheet of paper out, placing it carefully on the table between us. I did not push it toward them. I did not explain it. I simply let it sit there, visible but untouched. Their eyes shifted to it almost immediately. A document. Plain. Unremarkable at first glance. But something about it changed the air in the room. Before we go any further, I said calmly, there is something I would like you to look at. I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the paper, not covering it, just enough to anchor it in place. Then I lifted my gaze back to them, meeting each of their eyes in turn. Take your time. And for the first time since they walked into that room, none of them looked at me. All of their attention moved to the page. And as they leaned in slightly, reading the first lines, I watched the moment begin. The moment where the past stops being something distant and starts becoming something undeniable. Michael reached for the paper first, though not with the same confidence he had shown earlier. His fingers paused just above it for a fraction of a second, as if something in him already understood that once he touched it, there would be no going back to the version of the moment he had walked in with. Then he picked it up. Linda leaned closer, her shoulder almost touching his, while Stephen shifted his chair slightly forward, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read along from the angle. No one spoke. Not at first. Their eyes moved slowly across the page, line by line, the quiet in the room growing heavier with each second that passed. I watched their expressions instead of the document. That was where the real information was. Michael's brow tightened almost immediately, a subtle crease forming as he reached the second paragraph. Linda's lips pressed together, her usual composure slipping just enough to reveal something underneath. Stephen blinked once, then again, as if trying to make sure he was reading it correctly. I did not rush them. I did not explain. I simply let them see it for themselves. Because the truth, when presented without interruption, tends to land deeper. This, Michael began, his voice trailing off before he could finish the thought. He looked up at me briefly, then back down at the page, as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves if he gave them another chance. Linda reached out then, taking the paper from his hands more quickly than she intended, the movement sharp enough to break the stillness for just a second. Her eyes moved faster across the lines, scanning now instead of reading, searching for something specific, something that would make sense of what she was seeing. Stephen leaned in closer, his gaze fixed on a particular section near the bottom of the page. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands loosely in my lap, giving them the space to process without interference. 10 years ago, I had stood in a room much like this, listening to a document that changed everything. I remembered how it felt. The confusion, the disbelief, the quiet certainty that something was not right, even if I could not yet prove it. Now, the roles were reversed. And the difference was, I already knew how this would unfold. "Where did you get this?" Linda asked finally, her voice controlled but thinner than before. She did not look at me when she spoke. Her eyes remained locked on the page, as if breaking eye contact with it might make it disappear. I tilted my head slightly, considering the question. "It is an interesting document, is it not?" I replied, my tone calm, almost conversational. Michael looked up then, his expression sharper now, more focused. "This is not the version we were shown," he said. Not loudly, not aggressively, but with a clarity that had not been there before. I nodded once. "No," I said simply. The words settled between us, heavier than anything that had come before it. Stephen finally leaned back in his chair, his gaze lifting slowly from the page to meet mine. And in his eyes, I saw it clearly now. Not just recognition, not just uncertainty, understanding. The beginning of it, at least. "This is dated earlier," he said quietly. "Before any revisions." I did not confirm it. I did not deny it. I simply let the statement exist. Because sometimes, people need to say things out loud before they can fully accept them. Linda's grip on the paper tightened slightly. "This does not make sense," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "Why would there be two versions?" Michael exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping back to the document. "Unless one replaced the other," he said. The room went still again. Not with confusion this time, but with something else. Something heavier. I watched them carefully, noting the way each of them reacted. Linda's shoulders tensed, her posture closing in slightly. Stephen remained still, his expression unreadable but focused. Michael's jaw tightened again, but this time it was not about maintaining control. It was about holding on to something that was beginning to slip. I leaned forward slightly, resting my arms on the table once more. "That is one possibility," I said. My voice remained steady, unchanged, as if we were discussing something ordinary. But there was nothing ordinary about this moment, because this was where the past stopped being a distant memory and started becoming a question that had been waiting 10 years to be asked. And now, finally, it was sitting right in front of them, clear, undeniable, waiting for an answer none of them were prepared to give. No one spoke after that. Not immediately. The room held its breath in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if even the air understood that something irreversible had just been placed on the table. Michael was the first to move, but this time it was not to speak. It was to read again, slower, more carefully. His eyes traced the same lines a second time, his expression tightening with each word as if he was trying to find a flaw, a detail he had missed, something that would allow him to dismiss what he was seeing. But there was nothing to dismiss. Linda shifted in her chair, her posture no longer composed but restless, her fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the paper before she forced them still. Stephen remained quiet, but his gaze had changed. It was no longer uncertain. It was focused, calculating, as if he had begun to connect something he had not allowed himself to consider before. "This was signed," Linda began, her voice lower now, almost cautious, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile understanding was forming. She stopped, her eyes scanning the date again. "This was signed before the reading." Michael did not respond right away. He kept staring at the page, his jaw set, his mind clearly moving through possibilities, discarding them one by one. "And the version we heard," he said slowly, "was dated later." I said nothing. I did not need to. The difference between those two statements was enough. Stephen leaned forward again, his voice quiet but steady. "Which means the original was replaced." The word hung there. Replaced. Not revised. Not updated. Replaced. Linda inhaled sharply, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the edge beneath it. That does not prove anything, she said quickly, though her tone lacked the certainty it once had. There could have been a valid reason for a revision. Michael finally looked up then, but not at her. At me. And this time, there was no attempt to hide the question in his eyes. Was there, he asked. It was not confrontational. It was something else. Something closer to a man realizing that the ground beneath him might not be as solid as he believed. I held his gaze, steady and unhurried. You were there? I said calmly. You heard the reading. The answer was simple, direct, and entirely insufficient. Because it did not resolve anything. It only pushed the responsibility back to them. Linda looked between us, her expression tightening again. We trusted the process, she said. The lawyer. The documents. Trusted. Another word that sounded different now. Heavier. Stephen let out a quiet breath, leaning back slightly as he looked up at the ceiling for a moment, as if trying to step outside the weight of the room. Did we? He asked, almost to himself. That question did not need an answer. Not yet. I watched them carefully, noting the way each of them responded to the shift. Michael's focus had sharpened, his earlier confidence replaced by something more deliberate. Linda's control was slipping in small, visible ways, her need to maintain order clashing with the uncertainty in front of her. Stephen had gone quieter, but in a different way than before. Not withdrawn. Present. More present than he had been since he walked in. I reached for the paper then, not to take it back, but to adjust it slightly, turning it so all three of them could see it clearly without leaning in. A small gesture, but intentional. There is another detail, I said. My tone remained even, unchanged, as if we were still discussing something routine. Their eyes shifted immediately, drawn back to the page. The witness signatures, I continued, tapping lightly on the lower section. Look closely. Michael leaned in again, his brow tightening further. Linda followed, her earlier resistance replaced by a need to understand. Stephen did not move closer, but his eyes tracked the section I had indicated. The silence returned, but it was different now. Not passive, active, searching. And then, slowly I saw it. The moment it registered. The subtle shift in Michael's expression. The way Linda's fingers stilled completely. The slight narrowing of Stephen's gaze. They saw it. Or at least, they saw enough to know that something had been overlooked. Something important. I leaned back again, giving them space to process without interference. Because this was not about telling them what happened. Not yet. This was about letting them arrive at the edge of it on their own. And as they sat there, the weight of the document settling deeper with each passing second, I realized something that had taken me years to understand. The truth does not need to be forced into the open. It only needs the right moment. And when that moment comes, it reveals itself in ways no one can ignore. Michael saw it first, even if he did not say it right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the lower portion of the page, his expression tightening in a way that was no longer about confusion, but recognition. Not complete, not comfortable, but unmistakable. Linda leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against his again, her eyes moving quickly across the same lines he had already read twice. This time, she slowed down, and that was when her breath caught, just slightly, the kind of reaction she tried to suppress but could not fully hide. Stephen did not move closer, but his gaze sharpened, locking onto the section I had indicated earlier, his focus narrowing as if everything else in the room had faded away. These signatures, Linda said quietly, her voice thinner now, stripped of the control she had been holding on to. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Michael exhaled slowly, his hand tightening around the edge of the paper. They are not the same, he said. Not a question, a statement. I did not respond immediately. I let the words settle, let them hear them in the silence that followed. Because sometimes, hearing the truth in your own voice makes it impossible to ignore. Stephen leaned forward slightly, his eyes moving between the names, the dates, the details that most people would have overlooked the first time. One set matches the earlier date, he said. The other, he stopped, his jaw tightening as the implication formed fully in his mind. Linda shook her head, almost instinctively. That does not mean anything, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. People sign documents at different times. There could have been, she stopped again, because even she could hear how uncertain it sounded. Michael did not look at her this time. He kept his gaze on the page, his mind clearly working through the details, connecting them in a way he had not allowed himself to before. "No," he said quietly. "Witnesses do not change like that. Not without reason." The room went still again, but this time the silence was no longer searching. It was settling, heavy, final in a way that could not be undone. I leaned back in my chair, watching them without interruption, without pressure. They did not need guidance anymore. They were already there. Stephen was the first to look up at me, his expression different now. Not uncertain, not defensive, clear. "You knew," he said. It was not an accusation. It was an understanding. I met his gaze, steady and calm. "I suspected," I replied. The distinction mattered. Because suspicion is not proof. Not at first. Michael finally lifted his head, his eyes locking onto mine with a focus that had returned, but in a different form. Sharper, more deliberate. "Then why did you not say anything?" he asked. There was something in his tone now. Not anger. Not yet. But something closer to realization. I considered the question for a moment, not because I did not have an answer, but because I understood what it represented. 10 years of distance. 10 years of silence. 10 years of letting something sit, untouched, until it was ready to be seen. Because at the time, I said slowly, it would not have mattered. Linda's head snapped up at that, her expression tightening again. "Of course it would have mattered," she said. "If there was a mistake, it was not a mistake," Stephen interrupted quietly. His voice was steady, cutting through her words without force, but with certainty. Linda fell silent, her gaze shifting between them. Michael did not speak right away. He looked down at the paper again, then back at me, his expression more controlled now, but no less intense. "So you waited," he said. I nodded once. "I waited," I confirmed. The simplicity of the statement seemed to settle something in the room. Not resolve. Not yet. But a shift. A movement from confusion toward something more defined. Michael leaned back slightly in his chair, the paper still in his hand, though his grip had loosened. "And now?" he asked. The question hung there, quiet but heavy, carrying more than just curiosity. It carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment. I let a brief silence pass before answering, my gaze steady on all three of them. "Now," I said calmly, "you are here." The words were simple, but they held something deeper underneath. Because this moment was not just about the past anymore. It was about what came next, and whether they were ready to face it. Michael leaned back further in his chair, the paper still resting loosely in his hand, but no longer the center of his focus. That had shifted now. To me. To the room. To everything that had led them here. Linda sat very still, her earlier need to respond replaced by something quieter, more internal. Stephen remained forward, his elbows resting lightly on the table, his gaze steady, as if he had already accepted that whatever came next would not be simple. I let the silence sit one more time, not to create tension, but to allow space. Because this was not a moment that needed to be rushed. It was a moment that needed to be understood. "You are right about one thing," I said finally, my voice even measured. It was not a mistake. The words landed without force, but they carried weight. Michael's expression tightened slightly, not in surprise, but in confirmation. Linda closed her eyes for just a second, as if that single statement had settled something she had been trying not to accept. Stephen did not move. "Then it was intentional," Michael said. Again, not a question. I nodded once. Yes. There was no reason to soften it. No reason to reshape it into something easier to hold. Some truths do not become lighter when you change the language. They remain what they are. Linda opened her eyes again, her posture straightening slightly, a reflex, as if she was trying to regain some sense of control over a situation that had already moved beyond it. "By who?" she asked. The question came out quickly, almost sharply, as if narrowing the focus would make it more manageable. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I looked at each of them, one by one, letting the question settle in the space between us. Because sometimes the answer is not something that can simply be given. Sometimes it is something that needs to be recognized. "You were all there," I said calmly. "You all heard what was read." Michael's gaze did not waver, but something shifted behind it. Not confusion, not denial, consideration. Linda's fingers tightened again, though she kept her hands still on the table. Stephen exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly. "That is not an answer," Linda said, though her voice was softer now, less certain. I inclined my head slightly. It is the only one that matters right now, I replied. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was not heavy. It was still, like the moment just before something becomes clear. I reached forward then, sliding the document back toward myself, not taking it away abruptly, just moving it out of the center of their focus. Because this was no longer about what was on the page. It was about what they were beginning to understand. You came here looking for an opportunity, I continued, my tone returning to the same calm cadence I had maintained from the beginning. A way to rebuild. To start again. Michael nodded slightly, almost automatically. Linda remained still. Stephen's gaze stayed on me. And you may still have that, I said. That was when all three of them reacted. Not dramatically, but enough. A shift in posture. A lift of the eyes. A flicker of something that had not been there before. Hope. Careful. Guarded. But present. I let that moment exist for just a second before continuing. But this place, I added, gesturing lightly around the room, does not run on what people say they have learned. I paused. It runs on what they are willing to face. The words settled quietly, but they changed the shape of the moment. Because this was no longer just about the past. It was about accountability. About whether they could stand in the same room with what they had just seen and not turn away from it. Michael leaned forward again, his expression more focused now, more grounded. What are you asking? He said. I met his gaze, steady and direct. I am not asking anything, I replied. I am offering something. Linda's eyes narrowed slightly, not in resistance, but in concentration. Stephen did not look away. A position here comes with responsibility, I continued. Not just for the work, but for the truth. I let that word sit for a moment. And the truth does not stay contained. Not here. The silence that followed was different. Not uncertain. Not searching. It was reflective. Each of them sitting with the weight of what had been placed in front of them. Michael glanced briefly at Linda, then at Stephen, a silent exchange passing between them. Linda's posture softened slightly, though she did not speak. Stephen gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I watched them, not expecting an answer right away. Because this was not a decision that could be made in a moment. It required something more. Something deeper than agreement. After a few seconds, I leaned back in my chair once more, returning to the stillness that had defined the room from the beginning. Take some time, I said calmly. Consider what you have seen. I paused. And consider what you are willing to do with it. I did not need to say anything else. Because the next move was not mine. It had not been for a long time. And as they sat there, the weight of 10 years finally settling into something real, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided by the past alone. It would be decided by what they chose to face now.